Thank you for this opportunity, and good morning, good evening to everyone who's joining this webinar. Today I'm going to speak about practices, policies, and tools on implementing Article 5.3 of the WHO FCTC. And I'd like to start with a slide on the context of how the tobacco industry is operating. Well, evidence from many low and middle income countries show that the tobacco industry continues to market in ways that attract children. They challenge tobacco control measures, including through litigation, and attempt to partner with governments on anti-smuggling measures to undermine tobacco tax increases. But then the tobacco industry is also telling us a different story, that they say they've changed and they're promoting a smoke-free world, when in fact they're simply selling a new set of addictive products and are escaping liability for deaths and diseases caused by their traditional products. To make global impact, they are telling these stories in places like the World Economic Forum, the WHO, the ILO, UNGA, and through prestigious channels like Wall Street Journal, The Economist. And to reach policymakers, they utilize high-level global engagements that they sponsor, such as Concordia and TRACIP. To create new allies, they use foundations to dangle grants for science, labor, and agriculture. And to reach the public, especially the youth, they are, as our previous speaker said, they're back in Formula One, and they're widely active in social media. At the country level, they wine and dine the media and politicians, they fund researchers, and mobilize allies to support the e-cigarettes and heated tobacco product sales. More importantly, they are targeting regulators and decision makers for acceptance of their new products, particularly for a favorable regulatory environment and essentially incentives to run their businesses. Because Article 5.3 guidelines precisely limits the industry's ability to influence governments, we have in our hand the most potent tool to challenge the tobacco industry and to make progress in tobacco control. One aspect of the guidelines refer to regulation. The government must require information from the tobacco industry, denormalize its CSR, or so-called corporate social responsibility, and must not give it any preferential treatment to run its business. And this can be done only if the government is not co-opted by the tobacco industry. That means the government or its officials must reject partnerships and contributions from the tobacco industry. They must limit interaction unless strictly necessary for regulation, and ensure transparency of those interactions that occur. Government officials must constantly avoid or prevent conflicts of interest, as this hampers the ability to regulate. However, none of these can be done without raising awareness about tobacco industry tactics, and this includes monitoring the tobacco industry. And so the first step is really to communicate in order to raise awareness about tobacco industry lobbying, as well as to encourage civil society to help in monitoring the tobacco industry. A few examples of raising awareness include sending of a warning letter. For instance, in Vietnam and Poland, they warned cabinet members, universities, and local government offices about accepting funds from the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World. This is an entity that is fully funded by Philip Morris International. In Ukraine, Bangladesh, Thailand, and Philippines, government officials are seen actively supporting the launch of the Global Tobacco Index to help awareness about tobacco industry interference. The Global Tobacco Industry Interference Index is a publication by civil society trying to assess how the government is complying with Article 5.3 and its guidelines. The Philippine government also hosted workshops for customs and education officials to help them understand and resist tobacco industry interference. While Brazil, from whom you will hear of today, has made efforts to publicize their case against the tobacco industry. There are policies that specifically call for raising awareness of tobacco tactics, and many are found in their tobacco control laws. Some are more specific. In the Philippines, a civil service rule requires officers to report tobacco industry's attempts to approach them. In Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, notices and minutes of meetings with the tobacco industry are required to be posted online. Budget policies in Thailand and elsewhere allow the government to allocate funding for civil society-driven work to counter the tobacco industry. The next set of Article 5.3 provisions in the guidelines refer to rules affecting government officials, most of which are covered under a code of conduct. These are limiting interactions with the tobacco industry to those strictly necessary for regulation and being transparent with interactions that occur, and avoiding conflicts of interest or perceptions thereof, and rejecting partnerships with the tobacco industry. In practice, this is done mostly by rejecting tobacco industry's offer to participate in meetings of the Ministry of Health or Tobacco Control Committee. To ensure transparency, Australia, Canada, Panama records any meetings with the tobacco industry, and these are made available online or by request through a freedom of information policy. In 2015, for example, in India, officials, along with World Bank officials, withdrew from a meeting that was sponsored by an organization linked with the tobacco industry. In terms of policy, codes of conduct that bar tobacco industry influence are particularly helpful. In Philippines and Uganda, special codes or laws have been drafted to mirror Article 5.3 guidelines. In the UK and the US, they have a specific set of rules that apply specifically to diplomatic missions and embassies to ensure that these offices are not encouraging tobacco businesses. At the global level, there is a model policy to protect UN agencies from tobacco industry interference. Policies that ban donations, partnerships, and political contributions, such as those in Ukraine, Gabon, Canada, also serve to avoid conflicts of interest. While Kosovo and Mongolia has clear post-employment restrictions or a 1 to 2 year prohibition from working with tobacco companies upon leaving government services. On the other hand, Moldova and Panama and Uganda has policies to ensure that tobacco officials do not end up in tobacco control policy making. Finally, in many countries, tobacco control committees and health officers have a policy to reject or disallow tobacco industry participation. The last set of Article 5.3 guidelines refer to how we regulate the tobacco industry. We must require information from it, de-normalize its so-called CSR or corporate social responsibility activities, and should not give any preferential treatment or incentives to run its business. For example, Australia and France disallowed Formula One streaming in from abroad, and Norway had removed tobacco stocks from government pension funds, while China and India had rejected tobacco industry foreign direct investment from entering the country, and a few more countries have publicly rejected tobacco industry funds and activities. In terms of policy, many countries currently have a ban on so-called CSR of the tobacco industry. Some tobacco control laws specifically require marketing or lobby expenses to be required from the tobacco industry. There are also laws that specifically disallow incentives and preferential treatment to be given to the tobacco industry. There's also a law that promotes ethical investing, and this means removing tobacco industry stocks from their portfolio. Finally, the policy of discouraging trade or investment in tobacco is reflected in some free trade agreements, like the Australia-Singapore Free Trade Agreement. The CPTPP, which is a trade treaty among countries in Asia and the Americas, has provisions to effectively allow countries to bar tobacco industry from enjoying benefits of a dispute settlement mechanism. All of these practices and policies are embodied in publications and templates available in the website of the Framework Convention Secretariat's Knowledge Hub on Article 5.3. A very important resource for monitoring would be the guide for parties to establish observatories. For policy development, there is an Article 5.3 toolkit that can walk you through translating each aspect of the Article 5.3 into domestic policy. There's also a new resource for technical assistance that has been made available by the STOP watchdog. It's called REACT, where one can report tobacco industry interference and request for assistance. Finally, we have webinars like this one that is focused on countering tobacco industry interference. Many online resources are available to keep you up to speed on dealing with the tobacco industry interference. There are databases on tobacco industry allies, news reports and laws on a tobacco industry, There is a whole searchable database or library of tobacco internal documents at the UCSF, and also a list of cases online. There is a new global tobacco index, as I mentioned earlier, that ranks countries in terms of compliance with Article 5.3. And finally, there is the Framework Convention Secretariat Knowledge Hub on Article 5.3, a website run by GGTC, where you will find links to all of the resources that I presented today. Thank you.